Hi there, this is Jonathan Ginsberg. I'm an Atlanta area personal bankruptcy attorney, and today I'd like to talk to you about situations where it may not make sense to file bankruptcy, or it may make sense to wait months or even years before you file bankruptcy because the time is simply not right. And I will tell you that a lot of times folks, they research into bankruptcy, they talk to people, and they're stressed out, they have no peace of mind, they've got all kind of debts piling up, and it may be very tempting to say, I want to go ahead and file bankruptcy, get a little peace of mind, but it may not be the right time. And I think a good lawyer will tell you when it's time to think about holding off on filing bankruptcy and waiting until the time is really a bit better for doing so. And I want to talk to you about some of those times. First and foremost would be a situation where your total debt picture is unknown. You may incur more debt. So for example, if your main debt is medical related, you've got yourself or a loved one has a disease and it's requiring ongoing medical treatment, and the bills have piled up tens of thousands of dollars, and you're thinking about filing bankruptcy. The problem is, if you file bankruptcy now and you discharge a bunch of medical debt, what happens a year from now, 2 years from now, when additional medical debt has piled up? It may make more sense to wait until your situation has stabilized and you're not going to have a lot more debt before going ahead and using the bankruptcy option to eliminate that debt. Because realize in Chapter 7, for example, you can only file and get a discharge every 8 years. So do you really want to wait 8 more years to file bankruptcy and have to deal with all this debt that arose after you filed the first bankruptcy before you can file one again? And of course, you should always try to only file when absolutely necessary. So those are situations when it may not make sense to file because your debt may not be known. By the same token, if you've recently lost a job or you're having a job change, that may not be a good time because we may not know how much debt you're going to have. If you're going to be out of work for 6 or 8 months, you may incur new debt. And again, that would make sense to include that new debt into any kind of bankruptcy you file until you get back on your feet. And there can be issues with that as well about should you file when you're unemployed versus filing when you have a new job, but those are things to really discuss with your attorney. Now, when you're expecting a significant change in your income, that may also be a time to hold off on filing bankruptcy. Just as I was talking about, the issue when you're about to change income is you may be making more, you may be making less. We don't know. And bankruptcy really thrives on continuity, it thrives on certainty. So if you have a new job looming where you may be making more money, then you file bankruptcy and you're in the middle of bankruptcy, you get a new job, the trustee, the bankruptcy court is going to expect you to update your income information to reflect that new income. And if you do that, that may take you out of Chapter 7. It may make your Chapter 13 a lot more expensive. Much better to know what your expenses are and your income is going to be before you file and have it kind of stabilize a little bit. I've also talked to people, sometimes they're getting ready to move. Well, the new house, you may have different expenses with utilities. You may have a different mortgage payment. It's best to know. Bankruptcy thrives on certainty. It's not something that you want to do when there's a lot of unknowns. I will also tell you that if you start making less money, it's more difficult in the bankruptcy to adjust to less money even in Chapter 7 or Chapter 13, because the bankruptcy, the premise that you filed it on is that you had X number of dollars available to you either to reaffirm a debt or that's left over as disposable money. All of a sudden you're making less money, those assumptions go out the window, and it can create problems with reaffirmation in Chapter 7. It can create problems for your plan in Chapter 13. So it's best not to file as a rule when your job situation is unstable. You're likely to lose your job, change jobs, take on a new job. Much better to know where you are in terms of income before you actually pull the trigger and file. A third time when you may not want to file bankruptcy is if you don't owe a lot of money. Bankruptcy is not cheap, even though people say to me all the time, well, is it true that I can't really afford to file bankruptcy? That's crazy. Realize the filing fee alone for a Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 is around $300, a little bit over $300 for a 7, a little bit less for a 13 at this point, and it's just going to go up. Attorney's fees. In Chapter 7, you're probably looking at $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 for Chapter 7. Chapter 13, $4,000, $5,000, possibly more. Again, not all up front, but that's the total. So if you owe $20,000, does it make sense to spend $1,500 to file Chapter 7? If you owe 20 grand, does it make sense to spend $4,500 for a 13? Maybe it does, but a lot of times it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend such a high percentage relative to your debt to go into a bankruptcy. I feel a lot more comfortable with people when they owe $50, $60, $80, $100,000. That's when it makes sense to use the bankruptcy option. Realize bankruptcy stays in your credit report for a long time, up to 10 years. And if you're going to use it, which again, you should only really use it when absolutely necessary, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me to file bankruptcy when you owe $10,000, for example, unless you really, really have to. And there have been a few cases that I've had to do it for small amounts of money to stop foreclosure, stop a repossession, something like that. But generally, if you don't owe a ton of money, and by, I would say, my rule of thumb is $25,000, $30,000, I'm really hesitant to say whether it really makes a lot of sense to file bankruptcy. Fourth time when you may not want to file bankruptcy, you're judgment proof. And I see this a lot with elderly clients, people who they have no assets to speak of, their only income is Social Security. It may not make sense to file because you don't have to. If you don't really own anything, and if you have only Social Security income or income that's otherwise protected, simply let the creditors know you're judgment proof, write this off, and a lot of times they just leave you alone. I write what they call a drop-dead letter to creditors for people all the time. I may have to do it every 6 months or a year, but at the end of the day, my client doesn't get bugged anymore. We don't have to file bankruptcy. It's still in our back pocket if we need it, but we don't have to file bankruptcy because the client is basically judgment proof. So there is a peace of mind dividend to bankruptcy, but if you are in fact judgment proof, I don't know, it makes a lot of sense to file bankruptcy. I think another thing, this would be point 5, when it does not make sense to file bankruptcy, and that is if you don't really have a clear idea of what you want bankruptcy to do. How is it going to make a difference in your life? Where are you going to be 24 months from now, 12 months from now? And what do you want bankruptcy to do? And if you can't really say specifically what you want bankruptcy to do, how it's going to help you, then you got to really question whether it makes sense to file. Again, if you have a lot of debt, nobody's bugging you, the debt's just getting older and more stale, or you've lost a house to foreclosure, but nobody's coming after you for anything, it may not make sense to file bankruptcy at all. So I think it's important to have an idea what you want to bankruptcy to accomplish, discuss that with your attorney, and if you can come up with a really solid reason, then it makes sense to file. Otherwise, I'm not so sure that it does. And realize too, human beings, we're optimistic, most of us by nature. Realistically, unfortunately, things tend to get worse as opposed to getting better. So whatever your situation is now, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. And so if you're thinking about filing bankruptcy, but you could really wait on it, usually it makes sense to wait. And if things do get worse, then you can use the bankruptcy option, and you may find yourself in a better situation for doing that. I think number 6 would be when you would not want to file bankruptcy is when most of your debt is non-dischargeable, and certain debts cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. Child support, alimony, student loans, very difficult to discharge in bankruptcy, criminal restitution, debts arising from a DUI, many types of tax debt, certainly payroll tax debt, trust fund tax debt, not dischargeable in bankruptcy. So if you have 90% of your debt is non-dischargeable type of debt, bankruptcy will maybe buy you a little bit of time, give you some time to work on some things. It could be 6 months, it could be a couple of years or longer if it's a Chapter 13. But if you're not going to discharge your debt, you got to wonder whether it makes sense to really file bankruptcy, maybe look at some other options there. So if your debts are mostly non-dischargeable, then I would say no, it doesn't make a lot of sense to file. And finally, I would tell you to avoid filing if you have been engaged in activities or you're dealing with people where you're going to have to go into bankruptcy litigation. So, for example, if you you've done what they call credit card binging, where you took your credit card and went to the local stereo store and bought $10,000 of high-end audio equipment or big screen TV, things like that. Or if you have a creditor that there's a personal vendetta, and I've had a couple of those where the creditor just wants to screw with you, make life difficult for you, you got to question whether it makes sense to file bankruptcy. Because again, if you're going to find yourself litigating in bankruptcy court and paying an attorney $350 an hour to litigate, it can get really, really expensive really, really quickly. So it's best to go into bankruptcy knowing you're not going to have any big problem. And if you think there could be a problem, you need to be prepared to try to settle that problem so you don't have to spend a lot of money with a lawyer litigating, because litigation is a rich man's game. It is not something you want to be doing in your bankruptcy if at all possible. So those are just some thoughts about when bankruptcy may not make a lot of sense. Again, all these I would give you the caveat: talk to your lawyer, sit down with your lawyer, get a sense of the pros and cons of each of these things. But just realize that as bad as things are right now, they could get worse. And if you can delay filing, generally, this is, again, big picture general rule, delay filing because you may need the option, again, in your back pocket a year from now, 2 years from now. Hold off as long as you possibly can. Try to work something else out and make an informed decision after consultation with your bankruptcy attorney. Hope you found this helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up on YouTube, like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if I can answer any questions for you about the personal bankruptcy process, or you would like a free case evaluation, please reach out to me personally. I'm Jonathan Ginsberg. I am wishing you well. Thanks a lot.